Hey gang, so picking up where we left off before Dr. Moore had to come in and talk to me and stop me from doing everything and basically ruin my life. Just kidding, she's awesome, but she's the boss lady, gotta stop when she says to stop. So we're talking about the Scouring Rush, and we talk about the different names for it. So we have the horsetails, and then we talk about why they're called horsetails, and then we had Scouring Rush. And so this is a rush, goes down by the riverside. And if you were moving out west during the 1800s in wagons and dying of dysentery like you do on the Oregon Trail, you're probably cooking out of a big pan, like a big cast iron pan. And you're probably cooking over a fire, like hot fire, like, a campfire. And you probably got a lot of food burnt onto your pan. And you wanted to clean off all of that disgusting grit and grime and grease and just all the buildup and nasty stuff that gets on there. In order to do that, you would actually go down to the river. You'd get some of this horsetails, and you'd cut a bunch of it off. You'd roll it up into like a giant Brillo pad, and you would scour out your pan. And so that gave this plant the nickname Scouring Rush. And one of the reasons why it's so good at that, why is it good at scouring out cast iron pans? It's basically like sandpaper. It has a chemical in it that it's used in addition to cellulose to help it build up tall and for support to make it stand up. It uses silicon dioxide, which most of you probably know, that's glass. So this is sandpaper essentially, and it's got glass in it. And it's great for scouring out stuff. It's actually really, really, really rough and abrasive. Not so much where it's going to hurt you, but so much to where it's like sandpaper. So you definitely want to drag yourself back and forth through it. But that's the name. That's this type of horsetail Scouring Rush. It's one of the lycophytes. It's one of our seedless vascular plants. So let's move on to the seeding vascular plants. So the vascular plants actually have seeds. The first type is going to be Gymnosperms. These are going to produce seeds in cones. And so pine trees, perfect example. And there's tons of different types of Gymnosperms out there. Too many for us to go through in class without having like a big, huge lecture on it. But essentially, remember that the actual tree itself is the sporophyte. It produces a spore. That spore grows into the gametophyte, so it grows into the female cone or it grows into the male cone. And it's weird to think of, but that's the female cone. That's the gametophyte. This is the gametophyte. This is the male cone. You probably see these before. These get all over your car and all over the ground, and they crumble up really easily. These little suckers. You throw this guy at somebody, you're asking for a butt kicking. You throw this at somebody, ha ha ha, ow, it hurt. These things are really hard. You hit a lawnmower, hit one of those with a lawnmower, it's gonna break a window. Hit this with a lawnmower, it's no big deal. So, but these are all gymnosperms, and one of the easiest way to tell a gymnosperm for anything else other than the cone production is look at the leaves. And they don't have leaves; they actually have needles. It's kind of like a different way of capturing and maintaining sunlight. Most gymnosperms are what we call conifers, and conifers grow in colder environments. They're just really well adapted for that. They got out-competed in tropical areas by the angiosperms. And so when you start getting away from the equator, getting towards the poles where it starts getting cooler, you get less and less angiosperms, and you get more and more gymnosperms. And so we start seeing that most of them have these needles. And a couple of things. One, it's a great way of getting sunlight without having to completely defoliate every single year and be deciduous. Also, they're really good about not holding on to too much snow. I know we tend to think of, conifer trees as like Christmas trees and they're covered in snow. They are, but relatively speaking, that's not as much. And they're also a lot stronger and less likely to freeze because there's not as much physical area on the needle touching the snow as if this were a big flat broad leaf touching the snow. So it's less likely to cause damage to the trees. And they're actually pretty strong. If it snows down here and half the pine trees and the other trees around our area fall down, they can't handle the weight. But further up north, they're more flexible, they're stronger, and they're great. Gymnosperms are just awesome. They do all kinds of cool things. Look them up. And so if you're not a gymnosperm and you produce seeds, then you got to be an angiosperm. Angiosperms are anything else that other than conifers. So if it doesn't produce a cone and has vascular tissue, then it is some type of angiosperm. So trees, like oak trees, we don't think about it, but they produce flowers. They're just tiny. And like bees don't really pollinate them, but some might, but mostly it's going to be like flies and beetles and ants are going to pollinate these. But other ones have big flowers, like apple trees and roses, and then grasses are also all angiosperms. They produce flowers. Don't mow your yard for a while; you'll see flowers pop up. They're just not real big. They're small. They stay close to the ground. They're whitish, yellows, greenish colors. Really, they really don't stand out as much as like a rose does. But all of these use, between angiosperms and gymnosperms, one of the things I like to talk about is how they actually get pollen from one place to the other. So back up to gymnosperms. So we know this down here. We know exactly what this answer is going to be. How does the pine tree get pollen from the male cone to the female cone? Well, it's not going to do a targeted response. It's not going to say, hey, I'm just going to produce a few pollen and just aim really well to get it over here. No. The strategy here is produces tons and tons of pollen and just let the wind carry it. You may produce literally 100 million individual pollen grains. Maybe one will reach a female cone, but hey, it's success, right? Success. So we call those vectors. What vector does the pine tree use to get pollen to the cone? Well, he uses wind as a vector, right? And that's why you go outside during the April, March, into February in Mississippi, and everything is colored yellow, and you can see the wind starting to pick up. Those pine trees are producing pollen, and it's going everywhere, and our allergies go crazy, right? That's all part of the strategy. Just pump all your energy into making as many as possible. Don't worry about trying to lure in an animal to do the pollinating for you. Just use wind. Well, then how do angiosperms different? Kind of alluded to it. They actually are going to use their vectors that they're going to use is not really wind. They're going to use either insects, birds, or mammals to some degree to be able to get their pollen transferred. So this beautiful rose smells sweet. Inside of this flower is the male and female reproductive parts and some pollen. And it smells great. It's a lure. It's a bright color, so it's easy for bees and for birds and mammals to see. We can get in there. We smell it. Oh, it's good. We stick our nose in there. If you're a bee, you crawl in there. You get pollen all over you, and you go, oh, that was awesome. You stop and you stop and smell the roses. The bee then goes to another flower, and it's the same thing, thus transferring the pollen back and forth. So the vector that angiosperms use in order to pollinate are going to be other organisms, mostly butterflies and bees. Some use beetles, some use flies, some use birds, right? Hummingbirds and other types of birds like flowers and fruits and seeds. And then some use mammals, like big white flowers at nighttime usually are easy to see by bats as they fly around at night. So, flowers and, plants have found a really cool way to get pollen from point A to point B, and they use animals a lot. So smart of them, right? Right. So the last big thing when we look into our angiosperms, we have to note one big division within the angiosperms. This is going to be the difference between a monocot and a dicot. So the mono and the di means 1 and 2. Respectively, and the cot refers to cotyledon, which means veins. So just how many veins does it have? Easiest way is just looking at a seed. If you were to cut it open, is the number of veins. Easier is to watch the seed grow. If it puts up just 1 leaf, then it's a monocot. But if it puts up 2 leaves, then it's a dicot. So like grass is first shooting up, it's only going to put up 1 blade. That's going to be a monocot. But like a young tree, like a young oak tree popping up from the ground, it's going to put up 2 leaves, usually a major leaf and a minor leaf, right? A big leaf and a little leaf, kind of like a backup. That is a dicot. Grass is a monocot. There's some other ways to look at them. Look at the roots. How is the xylem and phloem arranged within the roots? If they're in circles and rings, then they're monocots. But if they're in a star-like pattern, then they're dicots. Where are those vascular bundles? If they're scattered, they're monocots. If they're ordered and around the outside, then they are then they are going to be dicots. The biggest way to look at a fully grown plant and see, without cutting it open or looking at its seed or watching it grow, is going to be just look at the leaf. If the veins on the actual leaf are parallel, 9 times out of 10 it is a monocot. If the leaves form a network, obviously if the veins in the leaf form a network, then it's going to be a dicot. And then people who know their flowers really well can walk up and just look at the actual numbers of petals on a flower. If they're in groups of 3s, then they are monocots. If they're in groups of 4s or 5s, or numerators, or numbers of 4s or 5s, then they are going to be dicots. A lot of time back in the 60s and 70s and even the 50s and 40s, housewives generally, well, the term housewife originated there, right? The man went off to work, the woman generally stayed home, raised the kids, did other stuff around the house. That kind of got boring, and then there's, keeping up the Joneses popped in, where you had to be just as good as your neighbors. It was kind of like a battle of the housewives, I guess you could kind of say, to who would have the better garden, because that took time and effort and energy to do. And it's a lot of people who didn't have careers during that time. A lot of housewives, just the way society was, did not have careers of their own at that time. So this was kind of their thing. Monocots were generally planted during that time because they are hard to keep up with. These are things that generally are bulbs or grasses, and grow like tiger lilies and or just any type of lily, actually. And a lot of the really pretty flowers that we see, what's another, like orchids are a big one. Anything that grows from a bulb, so like tulips are another great one to have. Roses are cool too, but they're dicots. But those took a lot of upkeep, and they took a lot of making sure that everything was right. You had to check them all the time, a lot of gardening outside. Thus, you're putting a lot of time and effort in showing off your beautiful garden, and you didn't entertain people back there. Nowadays, economy is different. We both look. We both got to work. I got to work. You got to work. We may not be able to even afford kids at that point, okay? Because times is hard and stuff's expensive. So let's get married. Let's you get a job, I got a job. We meet back at home and we eat dinner. We ain't gonna have kids. Ain't gonna have time for that. Y'all know who it is. Y'all know what the struggle. Hashtag struggle is real. I ain't got time to go outside and plant no bulbs. I ain't got time for that. I'm going to throw an azalea outside, a good hardy dicot, and maybe some roses, because I like roses. They're pretty easy to take care of. And nobody's going to push through a rose bush to get into your house because it's got thorns. So I'm going to plant that outside, and I ain't going to worry about planting monocots. But my grandmother's house, monocots everywhere. And she was outside all the time in her garden. It takes a lot of effort. But those dicots are really what we look for today, and especially with a busy lifestyle. So it's an example of how some of that, urban horticultural stuff can change as time changes and as economics and life changes for humans. We just don't have time to plant monocots anymore, even though they are really, really pretty. So yeah, monocots and dicots.